So I'm going to talk a little about the corals from the west. So we have a unique set of reefs in Western Australia. So it's actually the largest single coastline under one authority, apparently, but that still doesn't help. But we have reefs in the Kimberley area, and there was a little talk in the seminar about how these can actually survive very high temperatures. They can be exposed at low tides. So at least for short periods of time, they can withstand stress with temperatures that are quite high. And so we're trying to understand that process. But down along our western coast, especially starting from this Ningaloo area, we have a fantastic reef called Ningaloo Reef. It's one of the longest fringing reefs anywhere, and it extends about 500 k's down that coast. And we have another unique place, which is Abrolhos Islands. Again, a very interesting area. It's one of the most southerly reefs anywhere on our planet. It's also where the Dutch discovered this when they wrecked their ship, the Batavia, in the 1600s. And actually now in offshore Perth at Rottnest Island, we have a rapidly expanding, almost new reef as warmer water comes down southwards. We had an interesting event in 2011, which I'll come back and describe a bit more at the end of this talk, where we had some very warm water move down this western part and it did cause some bleaching. But the partly good news story is from sort of Ningaloo southwards, the corals are still in reasonably good shape. You notice there's no rivers, it's a very dry western margin of the continent, so we're fortunate in some ways. And the Lewin Current that brings warm water down is only occasionally getting warm. And I'll come back to this theme because it actually has implications for the barrier reef. What I'm going to talk about now, though, is a different part, the Pilbara. And we were doing some work up there, looking at some corals in a very interesting area. It's interesting because it's where a fair part of Australia's wealth is now coming from, this region. So there's been natural gas discovered at this location, Barrow Island. Chevron have spent something like $54 billion developing it. At least it's LNG gas, it's natural gas. So one positive aspect that for the energy burnt, the CO2 emissions are roughly half or a smaller fraction than coal. So it's a sort of semi-cleaner energy, but it's not perfect. And actually they are trying to sequester CO2 here in the processing. And currently now there's another equally almost big project, and both of these I should say involve massive amounts of dredging. So these two constructions have had more dredging done than any other place, certainly in the southern hemisphere. And until these projects started, these places were not that well known. But in 2010 with AIMS, and actually the vessel you saw on Janice's talk was actually used to do some of this initial work. There was an expedition done from Exmouth south up into this area through the Barrow up into Montebello Islands, and we found the people found fantastic corals. This is a Parietes coral. You can see one of our divers there. It's about 3 times bigger. We estimate conservatively this coral's at least 300 years old, maybe 400 years old. And in 2010, the terminology that was kind of describing this, all fine on the western front. Things look reasonably good. This is before the bleaching and so on. So just recently in April, we did an expedition, again starting from Exmouth, but I'll describe what happened as we went southwards. So the first area is this area called the Montebello Islands. It actually has a interesting history because this is where the British in 1952 through the 50s did their atomic bomb testing. So here's one of the clouds of bomb. And not surprisingly, and this is a sign here on one of the islands that says you shouldn't stay more than 1 hour on the island. So not surprisingly, this has actually been kept relatively almost pristine, if you like, because no one wanted to go near this area for obvious reasons. So we looked at some of the corals from this area. Actually the bombs were set off right here. We looked at a place here as well as north and on this other side. And this is what we found. Unfortunately, there were some these beautiful Acropa reefs that Ove was showing. Now they're totally decimated. They're now skeletons, remnants of, so you can imagine their former glory. quite unexpected because it's a long way away from any dredging activities or anything else, and not even much discussed. Yet that's what we found. And more surprisingly, as we came down, we went past Barrow Island, we came back down into here, this area, and those giant corals that I showed you first off, that's what they are now. They're totally dead. The water's all murky. It's not as clear as it was in the original photos, but they're no longer living. We had to work pretty hard, but we found actually that there's one or two corals where this is the dead part here, and this part is still living on the top. So we've now taken coral cores from these two areas. We're now going to try and do sort of an autopsy, if you like, as to what was the cause of the death. So this is actually what I'm showing here. This is the core from the dead part, and this is the part from the living part. You can actually see how they're cross-correlated, but this little extra part here was the extra growth since the death. So we're going to do an autopsy, do some geochemistry, look at the temperatures, look at the conditions, and try and understand better what's happening. We do know one thing is that right inshore, you'll see this white coral. It's another one of these parietes. We know that's bleached very, very recently because it doesn't have any algal growth on it. So this bleaching process looks like it's been going on for several years. Quite a surprise, I should say, because although this is actually one of the most intensively monitored areas anywhere. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars because there've been lots of dredging, but they've been so focused on their little pile of dirt, and they haven't noticed the whole wider picture that's happening in this area. So what we think happened is, certainly we know about this very warm bleaching event that came down in 2011 that warmed up this part of the coast, but this part in the Pilbara didn't look like it actually got that warm. So we don't understand what's happening. We do know that this warm water is part of what we call a La Nina phase, where there's correlations between warming here and in the Western Pacific. But we also know this blue here is a cool phase. So at the moment, the east coast of Australia is basically subject to a reasonably cool phase, and when it switches, it's going to be the opposite. WA will cool down, and the east coast will warm up. So, in a sense, what we're seeing in WA is kind of a precursor, we think, to what could happen on the east side. So, the GBR's had a temporary reprieve. We've had some bleaching. Because the reefs are well preserved, there's not much direct anthropogenic effects. They seem to have recovered. We hope that'll be persistent. We have an anomalous area in the Pilbara we don't understand. We just note that there's probably prolonged heating disease and maybe related to this dredging in some way, which we don't fully understand. And as I just pointed out, that, as I said, what we've learnt from the West may in fact be a lesson for what hopefully won't happen to the GBR, but obviously the mix of dredging and climate change is something you don't want to deal with, right? Either by itself is bad enough, both together can be just totally devastating. So on that point, I'll just cease. Thank you.
Thank you.